Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the show. Today's episode is a follow-up to an episode released back in December of last year, where I was talking about some new research into stress and how we don't just have one stress response, which most of us are familiar with, the fight or flight response. There's actually two additional options. So in that episode, I think it was episode 18, I talked about one response, which is called the challenge mode or challenge response to stress. And I'm not going to really go into that particular mode here. I'm going to be talking instead about the other particular response, which is the Tendon befriend pathway. But basically, researchers have kind of come to see that that one model that was kind of the dominant understanding of stress for about 80 years, since kind of stress started to be studied by researchers, isn't really the only way that our bodies can respond to stress. And there are these two additional ways with different hormones and neurotransmitters that allow our bodies to respond to stress differently, and that also have a bit of a less difficult and challenging, straining impact on our bodies. So fight or flight response is very much based in the hormone of cortisol, which when we have cortisol released into our body, it's great if there's an immediate threat, like a wild animal is chasing you and you need to run away or fight it off. But for many of us in modern society, if we're constantly in more modern stresses where we're not running away from things or fighting them off, and we're constantly releasing cortisol, it does things like elevate our blood pressure, it increases inflammation in our body, it has a whole lot of harmful effects on our body if we're constantly in that fight or flight mode and constantly being kind of drowned in cortisol. So these other modes, the challenge mode, which I spoke about previously, and this tendon befriend mode, they have different hormones that have a less harmful effect on our bodies over time. So understanding these and kind of learning how to work with these other modes is really beneficial for you if you're somebody who deals with a lot of stress, because you can actually change how your body is being impacted by those stressors. So what is this tendon befriend response? Let's start there. It's basically the idea of protecting your tribe. So bonding together with those that you love and you care about, your community, to kind of fight against or protect against a invader and make sure that everyone is safe. That's definitely a key part of this response. So this response is typically more common in women from kind of a historical perspective, because if you think of, living a tribe living in a village together and there was another tribe attacking, the men would probably be the ones going off and fighting off the invaders. The women would be taking care of the children and the babies and the elderly and making sure that the community kind of stayed safe. So coming together and working together to make sure that everyone is safe and finding kind of a way to protect the most vulnerable among people. So that's not to say tendon befriend can't be present in men and that men can't learn how to tap into this as well. But kind of from this perspective of how this developed, it was more common in women. And it's also more common in women because one of the hormones that it depends on is oxytocin. And of course, men and women both have oxytocin, but in women, oxytocin is kind of amplified by estrogen. And of course, women have a lot of estrogen, men only have very small amounts of female hormones. So there's kind of this natural tendency in women to look to the community, to look for resources and to come together and to work together to protect those in most need of protection. So the focus of this particular response when it gets activated is to reduce fear, because fear makes us kind of freeze up and maybe does get us into that traditional fight or flight state, and to increase hope. So it's like our ability to kind of think, okay, how can I not be afraid? How can I have hope? How can we work together as a community to deal with this particular threat, this particular stressor, and overcome it together? So that's kind of the tendon befriend pathway and response in a little bit of a nutshell. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of the hormones that get released, hormones and neurotransmitters in this particular response that are different than the fight or flight response. So the first one I already kind of mentioned, is oxytocin. And oxytocin is this bonding hormone that connects us to people that we love and care about. And so again, I mentioned that this is stronger in women because it's boosted by estrogen. So women are naturally more responsive to that oxytocin, and that's part of, again, the biology of being mothers and really being bonded to a baby and making sure that above all else, you're protecting that helpless baby in certain circumstances. So oxytocin is one thing that gets released in this particular response. Dopamine is another one. And then dopamine kind of makes you braver when it gets released. It dampens fear. So again, if we're in a fearful state, then we kind of lock up, we don't do anything, or we might respond more with aggression. But if dopamine kind of gets pumped through our system, that fear gets dampened, and then we're brave. We think, okay, I can do this. I can find a way to get through this. I can come together now with my community, and we can work through this particular challenge. The other thing, actually, I wanted to add back on oxytocin, it also kind of makes you more social with people. It brings us into community. So when we have a lot of oxytocin, it's more about we rather than I. And then another chemical that gets released when we're in this tendon befriend mode is serotonin. And serotonin does a number of different things when it gets released in this circumstance. So it makes you smarter. So you're like thinking, okay, how can, outside of the box kind of thinking, how can we find a way to get through this safely, and looking for solutions that might not readily be apparent. It increases your sense of perception. So you're really aware and alert, but it's not like that hypervigilant state where you can't think clearly and you kind of shut down. Instead, your senses kind of broaden out and you're super aware. Your intuition actually increases as well. You have more sense of self-control. I'm just kind of making sure I'm not missing anything by looking down. So we're just working with all of these different hormones, and then there are our endorphins also get released. So these four are kind of the key ones of the tendon befriend pathway: oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and our endorphins. And most of us know about endorphins from kind of exercise. They kind of pump us up and keep us going. So all of these are the main things that release in our body if we're in this particular mode. And you can see, if you compare a time when you felt like you were really in fight or flight, your heart was racing, you were, either ready to start punching people or start running away, that would feel very different than looking around for allies in that situation, feeling really brave, feeling like your perceptions are really heightened and your intuition is really able to be accessed, and it's heightened for you as well. So all of these things are a great way for our bodies to actually respond to stress. So now you might be saying, well, that sounds a lot better than fight or flight. So, what are there ways that I can actually start to access this? And so there's been some interesting research studies about this and ways that we can start to tap into this, because some of it comes from actually making conscious choices of how we want to respond to certain situations. So there was one study of kind of people in a work environment who were really stressed out, had a lot of work to do, high work demand. And what they did was they gave all of the people, they split them into two groups. So one of the groups, they just gave them, I think, like an hour to just do whatever that they wanted. They could take a nap, they could, take a long lunch, they could go get a massage, like whatever they wanted to do in that hour time frame, they could do. And then the other group, they actually asked those people to volunteer. And what the results of that were really interesting, because the people who were asked to do the volunteer work ended up feeling kind of less overwhelmed. They had less of that sense of time scarcity after doing that. They didn't feel like, oh my goodness, I have so much to do, so little time. They actually felt like, I actually have more time to do all of the things I need to do. They felt more confident. It was a real boost for these people. And then there was a second study of just asking people or giving people $100. And some people, it was like in the one group, you could do what you wanted with the $100, and some people, and they were asked, would you like to donate a portion of it to someone in need? And then a second part of the group was actually just that money was given to them, but they said, we're donating this money to someone in need in your name. And so what they found is those people who either voluntarily donated or were kind of mandatorily donating, that actually did give them a boost and help them and make them feel better. But those who choose to do that, who chose to make the donation, were given that choice rather than just, hey, we did this in your name, no choice about it. That was actually even more beneficial. So what these studies really show us is that choosing to, even when we feel overwhelmed, even when we feel stressed out, choosing to give of our time, give of our resources, making financial contributions to an organization that's important to you, volunteering your time, all of these things help you access this Tendon befriend response and activate these different pathways, which will then change your body and change how you're feeling, even if you are in a stressed out and overwhelmed state. So that's kind of the big takeaway from this episode, is just when you are feeling stressed and overwhelmed, this is one way that you can actually start to shift things, is to think about how, even though I'm stressed and overwhelmed and I have a lot on my plate and a long to-do list, I can still help other people, even if you're just taking, an hour out of your week and volunteering for an organization that you care about, or making a financial donation if you have the resources to a place. So I'm not advocating any particular organization or donating any particular place. I'm just sharing this research that when you do that, it actually activates this tend and befriend pathway. And then we get more of that oxytocin releasing, we get the dopamine releasing, the serotonin. And serotonin in general is about happiness. So if we're having more serotonin release in our system, there's also this boost of just feelings of well-being and happiness. Endorphins, again, they also give us that nice boost of feel-good neurotransmitters in our bodies. And oxytocin, we feel connected. So all of these are really beneficial hormones and neurotransmitters that we can tap into just through simple choices that we make in our life when we feel stressed out. Another way that doesn't necessarily mean volunteering your time, but if you're stressed out, reaching out for connection to other people, asking for support from other people, or working with other people who are feeling the same way as you. So if you have a project at work and a bunch of your coworkers are stressed, actually coming together and working together in that process to find a solution, you're also working with that tend and befriend pathway rather than just sitting at your desk kind of being overwhelmed. You're coming together and working as a team and as a tribe, and you're activating a lot of these hormones and neurotransmitters as well. So I find this research super fascinating because, for years and in the early part of my business, when I started 10 years ago, I was always talking about the fight or flight response and talking about, stress is bad for you. And certainly it can be bad for us if we're in chronic stress all the time, the fight or flight type of stress without relief from it, really being activated many, many times a day. Yes, it can be bad for us, but part of this research shows, and I think I talked a little bit more about it in the other episode in December, our mindset about stress is also tremendously impactful. So just by understanding that there are these other two options, so it's kind of like you're going down a pathway and you're stressed, and you can either continue down that pathway of the fight or flight, or realize there are these two other options that you can access: the tend and befriend pathway, the challenge pathway, and the two of them are kind of different and beneficial in different ways and more appropriate for different situations. Not everything always lends itself to coming together with a tribe. Not everything also lends itself to kind of getting in that mindset of, oh, this isn't like a life-threatening situation is just a challenge, how can I access that? There's different situations where one or the other is more appropriate, but just by knowing that those different kind of tracks exist. So you're going down this one pathway and then it splits into three. You can continue down that traditional pathway of fight or flight, or you can take one of these other alternate options. Just understanding they're there and having some ways of starting to work with them is really, really beneficial so that you don't stay in that overwhelmed state. And it shifts your mindset too, to realize that, stress isn't always dangerous. Stress doesn't always threaten our health, because that's one of the big messages that was out there for a very long time is, stress is dangerous, stress can kill you, stress can make you sick. My response to that is it certainly can, partly through your mindset, and if you don't do anything to change how you're responding, but stress doesn't necessarily have to be that for you. Just changing your mindset alone about stress is powerful, and then being able to access other alternative ways to respond to stress is also very, very beneficial. So if this particular topic and the episode that I shared about challenge mode really is intriguing to you, I highly recommend the book, The Upside of Stress by Dr. Kelly McGonigal, because it goes more into this topic and it gives you different ways that you can start to play with these different modes, different exercises and tools and stuff that you can use to experiment when you're feeling stressed out. So it's a very accessible read. Yes, it does have research in it, but it's not written in a way that you feel like you have to have a scientific background in order to understand it. It's written so that a lay reader can easily understand and absorb it. So that's would be my recommendation if this kind of sparked your interest. I've read the book. It's a great book, and I highly recommend it for learning a little bit more about understanding stress in different ways, because the more empowered we are to understand that there are different ways that our bodies can respond, the more our bodies can actually have those options. We can tap into them and we can protect our health rather than just let cortisol and fight or flight and all of those things have a tremendously negative impact on our health and on our bodies. So thank you for taking the time to listen to today's episode, and I'm excited to share with you more in the next episode.